Heyo, I'm Arinum. So I'm not the only one who has a ton of games in my backlog, right? It feels like during every Steam sale, I see all the games on my wish list with so many discounts that I go, ooh, add to cart, add to cart, add to cart, until I have like a dozen more games than I had just an hour ago. The problem is I never remember to actually play most of them. And I know I'd love, or at least like, every single one of them. Yet the backlog grows and grows. But not this time. For this video, I decided to play as many short games as I could within a week to try to make a dent in that ever-growing backlog. I was able to play through 7 games in that time, and when I combine that with all of the other games I played throughout the years, I think I've learned a lot about what makes a shorter game so special. And so, I'd like to talk about it and share what I've learned with you. Now, there's way more games out there that I haven't even heard of. So if there's a game that you like, that you feel deserves more attention, please let me know. I'm always on the lookout for new titles to check out. Now, real quick, what do I mean when I say a short game? I know it's probably self-explanatory, but with some games asking their players to dedicate over 100 hours to them, something closer to 10 or 20 hours might feel short in comparison. But for this video, what I'm referring to are games whose runtimes are about 5 hours or less. They get in, say what they have to say, and get out, in essentially the span of an afternoon. Short and sweet. It could be of any scope and any fidelity too. It could be made by a huge studio, or created by one person in their bedroom. As long as it fits the runtime brief, then it's fair game for this video. With that out of the way, let's talk about one thing that I love from these types of games. Basically, I find that they're fantastic opportunities for exploring new, exciting, and maybe experimental ideas. Since they're so short, it makes sense to take more risks and to commit to a more niche vision. And so the relationship between the game and the player can be more risky. The game isn't asking weeks of dedication, it's only asking for a few hours. And so, it's much easier to explore some what-if scenarios, play with weird concepts and see them through to the end, embrace the wackiness or the moodiness to its fullest. Be as authentic as possible by committing to a vision that just doesn't make sense for a 100-hour open-world RPG. If it doesn't work, then hey, no big deal. It was only for a few hours. It might not work for some people, but because the runtime is so short, that's perfectly fine. Like, let's play the what-if game right now. What if a cat piloted a Metroid-style mech suit? Well, you'd get something like Gato Roboto. What if there is a tiny clown the size of a bug? You'd get a game like Poco. This sort of experimentation can be incredibly successful. Just look at Five Nights at Freddy's, a tiny point-and-click horror game that blew up and sent the entire genre of mascot horror into hyperdrive. Even though FNAF is not really my thing, I can't deny how impactful it's been over the entire media landscape of the past 10 years. But I think there's one game that really exemplifies how successful playing What If can be, because it's maybe the biggest success that a short game has had in the past few years, at least from what I can tell. The game I'm referring to is Stray. In case you haven't heard of it, Stray is a third-person exploration game where you play as a cat who's fallen into a decaying cyber city. Your goal, as this orange kitty, is to find your way out and get back home. I like to think that the success of Stray is because of the simplicity of its own what-if scenario. As far as I could tell, and based on my own interpretation of how the game is marketed, the what-if is simply, what if you played as a cat? I think this was a novel concept at the time, to a general audience, and I find that the success of Stray comes from the fact that the developers, Blue 12 Studio, really committed to this what-if scenario. It's incredibly clear that Blue 12 knew how to make a game where you play as a cat by crafting the mechanics and the visuals to fit within the what-if scenario as best as possible and as much as possible. The opening of the game involves pretty familiar behaviors that cat lovers, like myself, have come to expect. How they play, how they socialize, what they move like, what they sound like, all of it is present here and throughout the game, making the protagonist, the nameless cat, feel shockingly realistic, which I think is a big reason why Stray was so successful. But a game doesn't need to be a massive commercial success to be great at playing what if. In fact, I think some of the biggest innovations happen when a game takes risks at the very core of its DNA. This may be why they're less commercially successful, but it's still worth doing, because it's very exciting to experience as a player. What I mean by this is playing what if with the gameplay mechanics. Take Donut County, for instance. It's a very simple concept that's been replicated over and over in the years since it was released, back in 2018. You play as a whole, gobbling up things, growing bigger, swallowing up even bigger things to get even bigger, and so on. As far as I can tell, Donut County is the originator of this mechanic being done successfully, which is shocking to me since the mechanics feel so natural. It's really intuitive piloting these holes under things to suck them into the earth, and it's also intuitive that the hole gets bigger and bigger to let you eat bigger things. I'm not sure why it feels like this, but hats off to the developer, Ben Esposito, for making the silly concept seem so natural. Even further, Donut County's gameplay also involves a fair bit of puzzles with these ever-growing holes. Like, what if they get filled with liquids? Or what if they're used like a chimney flue? Despite black hole games being very simple at their core, I find that Donut County stays fresh because it constantly introduces new mechanics to go with the core gameplay. And also, it certainly helps having a banger soundtrack. Let's play Mechanical What If a couple more times to really bring it home. What if you turned navigating public spaces into a puzzle game? Well, then you'd have Is This Seat Taken? A silly, cozy logic puzzle game where you have to work out where to place some particularly picky polygons in public spaces, like trains and cafes, adjusting for their preferences and pet peeves. The concept sounds like it could get frustrating really fast, but the developers at Poti Poti Studio keep it at a difficulty level that feels just right to me, which I found really impressive. Or what if you made a platformer where you play as an egg? Then you'd get something like Foul Damage, a puzzle platformer where you're an egg that can jump pretty high, but if you jump too high or fall too far, then you'll pull a Humpty Dumpty. It's a novel concept, and it's executed really well, making for some pretty interesting puzzles, I think. All the while, it's just long enough to feel like the idea is thoroughly explored, without overstaying its welcome. That's the common through line for all the games I've talked about so far, actually. The reason all of these games work as complete pieces, Donut County, Foul Damage, and even Stray, is because they know when to wrap things up. Like, sure, you could play as a whole for dozens of hours, but it would probably get stale really fast. And so Donut County acknowledges this by keeping each level about a few minutes in length and keeping the total runtime at about 2 hours. I know it might sound weird asking for less game per game, but there's so many games out there, and there's only so much time to play all of them. And so when a game respects that fact and makes its time spent with the player as something valuable, then I find that the experience as a whole leaves a much greater impact in the long run. Along those lines, I do find that if a game doesn't leave a mechanical impact, it can leave a mark simply as a piece of artistry and a showing of craftsmanship. What I mean by this is when a game commits uncompromisingly to a specific vision that may not have innovative gameplay, but is incredibly expressive and novel when it comes to the visuals or even the format of video games itself, like with the game Everyday Devil. This game is a short, linear story that showcases snippets from the life of some random demon guy. The game's words, not mine. What I find so interesting about this game, though, is the fact that it embodies the term mixed media in a way that feels really fresh and really exciting to me. Each of these snapshots of Cecil, the demon guy's life, take the shape of a different type of video game. There's top-down RPG style walking around and interacting. There's 3D horror game style. There's hints of visual novel here and there. And there's even a first-person shooter section. There's also a blend of 2D sprites and a 3D space all over the place, adding to the hand-drawn, dreamlike mood. This may sound like a cacophonous mess of genre tropes, but what ties it all together is the uncompromising commitment to the world and the aesthetic that the main creator of the game, Alisor, has been developing through her art over the years. And so it all comes together incredibly to make a cohesive, immersive, and atmospheric sort of horror game. Quick tangent, I've been a huge fan of Alisor's for years, and so finally playing a game like this was like eating candy until I get a sugar overload. Ugh, it's so good. It's so good. Now, there's another game that very well might be the granddaddy of modern artsy games. One that came out over 10 years before Everyday Devil, and one whose impacts are widespread, whose legacy can be felt throughout dozens, if not hundreds of titles since its release and miraculous success. Let's talk about Journey. Initially released back in 2012, Journey is a minimalist, atmospheric, sort of adventure game. It's really hard to actually put labels on it though, because it sort of does its own thing. Where Everyday Devil leans into the fact that it's a video game, Journey shies away, making it the least video gamey that it can be. And this is a good thing. Journey's hook, as I understand it, is to be appealing and resonant with everyone. It seems to be crafted around the idea that anyone can pick up the controller and follow along. In fact, most of the gameplay involves simply walking forward, with very little guidance and absolutely zero words or narration. There's also a criminally good score to go along with it. Like, my god, the music here sounds straight out of a movie. And, well, with a playtime of about 90 minutes, it seems to me like Journey is attempting to fill the role that a movie would. Create a story with highs and lows and plenty of cinematic shots, but in a way that feels natural and approachable to its medium, video games. It's not a movie game by any means, because it embraces the fact that it's an interactive medium. It may be minimal in its presentation and gameplay, but it's far from vapid. It's an adventure that is friendly, cinematic, and emotionally resonant for genuinely everyone, which is an incredible feat of artistry. And speaking of emotionally resonant, the last thing I want to touch on is probably my favorite thing about short games. It's the fact that a lot of the time, they feel very intimate. A short game is usually made by a smaller team of people. Not all the time, but usually. And so because of this, much like because the runtimes of these games are shorter, they can have the space to be more specific and more personal. They don't necessarily need to be mechanically innovative or artistically moving because the individual pieces aren't the whole story. Games, no matter how scrappy and rough around the edges, are more than the sum of their parts. And I think it's hard to find a better example of this than A Short Hike. As far as I can tell, A Short Hike is the golden child of the indie game space. And this is in large part because the majority of the game, the design, the art, the programming, was created by one person, Adam Robinson Yu. That's not to say it was made exclusively by one solitary developer. The music was composed by Mark Sparling, for example. And in fact, I think the myth of the solo developer is a bit hyperbolic and can be harmful at times. But the point is, the vision and a lot of the execution of A Short Hike was crafted by this one developer. There's a GDC talk from a few years ago where Adam, I hope it's okay to call him Adam, where Adam hosts a post-mortem of A Short Hike, talking about its inception and working within his own limitations to make it. It's a great talk, and I highly recommend it, even if you're not a developer. Anyways, I find that A Short Hike works so well because it's very clear that it's a product of its creator. Adam's own artistic strengths and weaknesses are cranked up to 11, and so the game as a whole is an expression of this one person at this one time in their life. It encapsulates the journey that they've had in game development so far, and it highlights the creative decision-making process that goes into molding this warm, quirky, tiny island of a world. For A Short Hike, that one person is Adam, but this feeling, intimacy between the player and developer, can be found all over the place in indie games. One other game where I felt that intimacy recently is in The Moon Looks Beautiful Tonight, created by Team Seta City. It's a visual novel set in an alternate timeline where the moon has been ejected from Earth's orbit, and the game follows two maintenance workers who are left stranded there. Even though, as far as I could tell, the core development team is larger than A Short Hike's, the story feels incredibly personal. Plenty of layered dialogue, introspective scenes, and a premise that lends very well to the vulnerability found throughout the story. Because, yeah, there's a ton of vulnerability going on here. I'm still thinking through it all, honestly. What all the pieces mean and how it comes together into a cohesive metaphor. This sort of thing is exactly why I love indie games in general. I love immersing myself in a world like this, in the gorgeous art and the colors and the lighting, and the uniqueness of the scenario itself. And I love how it feels when all the pieces fit together to elevate the story it's centered around. And it seems, at least to me, this sort of hyper-specific, extremely focused piece of art works best when a game commits to a shorter runtime. A game like The Beginner's Guide can play with the meaning of video games and art in general, using the medium itself and the very act of playing as storytelling devices. A game like TOEM can make a dynamic gameplay loop out of photography, taking an activity I usually think of slow and methodical and making it quick and snappy. There's so many different ways for games to play what if like this. And I think when a game commits to a shorter runtime, like with all of the games I've touched on in this video, the developers have the freedom to polish and refine and hone in on that unique and specific vision. The types of experiences that make me think, where has this been all my life? That make me feel, over the past 2 or 3 hours of gameplay, like I've grown more as an artist and a game developer. So I guess if I had to do some sort of call to action for this video, I'd say try out that game you've been sitting on for a while, or maybe try out a completely new one. There's so much that goes into the craft of making games, and there's so many ways to express oneself that there's always something to gain in playing them. Whether you overcome some mind-warping puzzles, or traverse through some flowing piece of artistry, games are always worth experiencing. And I find that when you spend some time with shorter ones, like the ones from this video, you can nurture your appreciation for the craft and allow it to grow and blossom right before your eyes. And that feeling makes me fall in love with video games as an art form time and time again. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this thinly veiled excuse to talk about some games that I like. And if you did like it, it would mean a ton if you considered liking and subscribing. In the description, there will be a list of all the games shown on screen throughout this video in case you wanted to check any of them out. And also a huge shout out to my patrons over on Patreon. You really help make it possible for me to keep making these videos and talking about video games and how they're amazing. And so I really appreciate any support. And with that said, the spring video topic poll is still up for a few more weeks. So if you wanted to vote on the topic of probably my next video, now is the time to sign up. But yeah, thank you so much for watching again, and I hope to see you in the next video.